and thank you very much for this lovely invitation. I'm in the perfect cluster this afternoon. Very good company. As someone who has worked on geopolitical borders with regards to migration for many years, I'm sure you will allow me to speak here about a different kind of crossing that I have become very interested in when investigating oil and other natural resource geographies in different locations in the world. So in my recent video work, I look for conceptual and aesthetic tools with which to engage in ecologies on this physically transforming planet. The search for natural resources in the Americas has led directly to indigenous land, which in many cases enjoy abundance of oil, gas, and minerals, as well as healthy forests and waterways. Predictably, the epic financial interest and the surging extraction projects have left devastation in the wake. Indigenous peoples in the hemisphere face one of the worst crises since the arrival of European colonizers, a crisis that is fueled by the same frontier spirit. Frontiers have just been continuously pushed further back into the forest. As devastating as many of these cases from Chile to Canada are, the indigenous struggles have helped driving forward the groundbreaking legal reforms which harbor the potential for larger planetary perspectives for survival. In two recent video projects that I'm going to discuss here now today, I address the complex entanglements of oil, forest, climate, and geopolitics on this larger plane. Deep weather, by engaging the Earth as a closed system, and forest law, by bringing indigenous cosmology and the rights of nature into the arena. As to deep weather, I think it's best to show you a clip. The video draws the connection between the relentless unearthing of fossil fuels in northern Canada and the protective measures undertaken by Bangladeshi communities on the other side of the world, two remote and simultaneously occurring scenes connected through the atmospheric chemistry. Deep weather thickens the understanding of these geographies by reaching into the interior of the Earth and expanding 100 miles into the atmosphere, because fossil extraction is not merely a geopolitical concern, but also a bioplanetary reality. Pushing extraction frontiers far into pristine areas necessitates the construction of extensive infrastructures, including roads, heliports, seismic lines, settlements, land, and communication networks reaching into these remote habitats. All of these drastically change the living and migrating space of hundreds of species, including humans. Native communities now travel several days before reaching their hunting grounds, when they could get there before in 2 or 3 hours. But for Aboriginal folks, the damage reaches beyond blocking traditional hunting practices. Local mythologies and divinities animate their land. The landscape contains both worlds. It's a psychosocial habitat. The noise, subterranean sonar waves and vibrations, and the invisible toxic juices seeping into the lakes and rivers contaminate not only the biological, but also the psychic ecology. The legendary quality of this collective space on the brink of disaster is evoked by the whispered voiceover. The second part of the video, Deep Weather, turns to Bangladesh. Here, the consequences of melting Himalayan ice fields, rising planetary sea levels, and extreme weather events define living conditions, particularly in the Delta. Bangladeshi communities are making innovative efforts to adopt to an amphibian lifestyle. There is one scene that I found particularly emblematic for an age of global warming, the tremendous community effort made to build protective mud embankments. It's measures undertaken by people who have to find ways of living on water as large parts of Bangladesh gradually submerge. With corporations operating globally, the issue of accountability has long left the constraints of national boundaries. But the changing air chemistry has propelled it onto the planetary scale, entering a whole new dimension where cause and effect are no longer in a direct relationship. You cannot easily name one originator. It has turned into a complex causal field. Under the perishable sky, the world fuses together. Climate change forces us to deal with invisible dynamics. Timothy Morton speaks of global warming as a hyperobject, a very large diffused object that is permanently present, but not localized in a material sense. All we ever get to see are its footprints. And since global warming occurs in much vaster temporalities, it phases in and out of the shorter human time frame of perception. That, according to Morton, is how it withdraws from our visibility. So from our mortal, earthbound standpoint, the phenomena is partially eclipsed. There are gaps in our cognition that need to be breached. Perhaps art can play a role in conveying the immaterial and somehow spectral nature of climate change, for instance by bringing remote and apparently unrelated locations to interact on the same visual plane. One thing is clear, the geopolitical lens that spatially expands on the global scale but temporarily zooms into very short-term effects and revenues is failing to help us see these larger realities. As we scoop out geological matter from deep layers into the daylight and out into the atmosphere, global warming forces us to think in deep time. I want to turn to a new piece now that is titled Forest Law, which is going to be installed at the upcoming exhibition at Nottingham Contemporary towards the end of January. This project too entangles with forest, oil, climate, and geopolitics, this time by bringing indigenous cosmologies and the rights of nature into play. Forest Law is a collaboration with Brazilian architect Paulo Tavares, whose substantial research in Amazonia lays the ground for his field study and videography in Ecuador. Significantly, Ecuador got a new constitution in 2008 that was a result of a number of indigenous uprisings in defense of their commonly owned land and their way of life. This new constitution declares Ecuador a plurinational and inter-ethnic state and introduces a series of innovative legal elements such as the concept of summa causae, translated as good living, and the rights of nature, which contend as ecosystems, the living forests, mountains, rivers, and sea are legal subjects. With these laws, Ecuador expands its jurisdiction to a multi-species population. The first article of the Rights of Nature, for instance, stipulates that nature has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its vital cycles, structures, functions, and evolutionary processes. In the event that these rights are violated in any form, the newly declared juridical subjects may be defended in court by a person or collective group. For the indigenous communities whose livelihood is entirely dependent on the forest, these laws, if enforced, can guarantee their own survival. Forest law concentrates on three landmark legal cases that are unfolding in the Ecuadorian Amazon. The project takes a slow road in trying to understand the ecological and cosmological dimensions of these paradigmatic trials, to understand on behalf of the forest and its people. One legal case has been brewing in Shuar territories in the south of Ecuador, where the giant copper mining project closes in on indigenous lands. Another unresolved case resonates throughout the film as the haunting memory of the large-scale contamination of soils and water caused by Texaco in the 70s. I'm going to show this clip in a moment. This was supposed to be a still, actually. At the heart of the project, however, lies the case of Sarayaku, a Quechua people who owns a large territory that can be entered only through the river or by flying in on a propeller plane. The village council decides on each and every visitor who enters the territory. Sarayaku has good reasons to control its boundaries and entry points. As we learned from an interview with Jose Galinga, leader of Sarayaku people that you see here in the picture, in 2002 an Argentinian oil company intruded in their territory with their explorers, workers, and military enforcement. Sarayaku responded to this violation by installing peace and life camps on their territorial boundaries and simultaneously by preparing a case for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. As in Alberta, the company came and laid out their seismic lines across the land to form a deadly grid of buried explosives in the rainforest. What was particularly appalling to the Sarayaku people is that they targeted a forest area that is meant for the reproduction of animal species. Sarayaku has organized its territory into hunting zones, fishing zones, and reserves, which they consider the living forest, selva viviente, where they hardly ever go themselves because they are considered sacred places. For strangers, these territories have no life, Galinga says, but for our people, these territories are alive. The elders who spoke up during the public hearings at the Inter-American Court claimed that if the forest disappears, they too will vanish, because, as a shaman said, the destruction of the jungle erases the soul. What makes this case so important is that it evolves at the intersection of human rights and the rights of nature as two profoundly entangled realms. After a decade of struggle, Sarayaku won the case and witnessed what they hadn't realistically hoped for, an official apology by the state of Ecuador presented to them last month. The apology was part of a ruling of the Inter-American Court. The judges condemned Ecuadorian state for violating the rights to communal property. This verdict confirms that when traditional lands are involved, the rights of property has become the court's standing ruling on indigenous rights. However, as legal scholar Thomas Nkoviak argues, the right to property cannot serve as a stronghold for indigenous people's survival, because domestic and international law grants states great leeway to interfere with property. Instead, he proposes that a broad right to life concept known as vida digna serve as the new structural basis, and this would situate the case more firmly in the regimes of international human rights. And this certainly makes a lot of sense considering their philosophy of summa causae. Forest law takes a different route. From the beginning, the plot is placed in a context of climate change. Zooming out from a dark, misty rainforest, the video prologue evokes the Earth as a living, breathing planet, whose surface has evolved into ecosystems that keep her metabolism alive. A 4-degree rise of temperature would be enough to disable the Amazon ecosystem and turn it into dry scrub. With this important cooling system shut down, the planet turns increasingly hot and dry, with ever-shrinking land left for human food production. When the forest is gone, world civilization will have come to an end. In other words, what unfolds in this remote corner of the rainforest is of worldly importance. What moves to the foreground of our intellectual attention are the most material concerns. The greasy, toxic mud of oil spills comes under forensic scrutiny before forest law. No longer the background to human history, the landscape, nature, matter itself turns to the fore and becomes the subject of interest. And we are stunned by the insight that nature, and hence life forms and their ecologies, are treated by the world legal system as mere property to be sold and exploited and consumed. While we have parceled off the land into small cells that can be owned and exploited, entire living systems of the earth are legally invisible. For the indigenous communities, these vital entities are inhabited and protected by the masters of the forest and the water with whom they commune. Forest law regards these groundbreaking legal cases in the Amazon as an opportunity to consider an important legal potential that lies both beyond property rights and the human-centric status of international law. The video unfolds a landscape that is populated by all kinds of sentient beings who inhabit different dimensions of reality. It delves into cosmopolitical considerations. What if we claim the Charter of Universal Rights of Nature in the way human rights were once declared and fought for? What if species and ecologies are no longer eclipsed behind property claims over the land on which they live, but actually take on subject status? The human-centric paradigms underlying our legal organization would be radically displaced. Perhaps the Ecuadorian rights of nature and the arguments that won the case of Sayaku can serve as a starting point for a model and a model for a global framework of law. Art has the ability to activate this sort of shift that allows for the what-if moment. By evoking the planetary conditions of climatic destabilization, loss of biodiversity, and toxic pollution, forest law addresses these cases as simultaneously rooted in local histories of violence and expropriation, as well as pertaining to a broader terrain of struggles which speak of a global universalist cosmopolitics. Thank you.